Today, I'm showing how we can build an accessible and responsive biography grid using plain HTML and CSS inside the Pinegrow website editor. I had originally recorded this video as part of a series where I built the same design using Oxygen, Elementor, Pinegrow, Bricks, and Generate blocks, but frankly that got unwieldy since each build took more than 30 minutes. On top of that, the page builder landscape took a few giant shifts within the span of a few weeks, making a lot of what I had recorded obsolete. In the end, I just scrapped the whole thing. Now, I decided to resurrect the Pinegrow build to use as the foundation for a shorter series on how to create custom WordPress blocks using Pinegrow. This video focuses on the core structure of the components, and it's platform agnostic, so you can take the same code and apply it to your own projects. Whether you're building a website using plain text or using a developer-focused site builder like Oxygen, Breakdance, or Bricks, this should still apply. For other WordPress builders such as Elementor or Generate blocks, the concepts remain largely the same, but you'll probably have to adapt the implementation a bit to match their particular workflows. One last note, I apologize in advance for the audio consistency in the beginning of the video. I ended up taking clips of what were going to be different videos and putting them together into this one introduction. As you'll hear, I was using different equipment in each video, so you may notice some differences in a few sections. Before I get into how these cards work, I want to get into the core website tenets for every website build. They're accessibility, stability, scalability, and maintainability. Accessibility means that each component is going to work regardless of what kind of device you're on or how you're accessing it. Whether you're on a computer or a desktop or a laptop or a mobile device, whether you're using a mouse and keyboard, your phone, or a screen reader to access it, you can still get to everything that you need. Stability means that it shouldn't break for no reason, and updates to one component shouldn't break something else. We shouldn't rely on third-party plugins for things that don't need it, and we shouldn't have anything extra slowing things down. Scalability means that we build things in a way that makes sense, whether we're doing it once or 1,000 times. And lastly, there's maintainability. That means that changes to one element should update all other similar elements across the site. For example, if a client comes to me and says that they want to change the color of one of these buttons, changing that color in one place should update similar buttons everywhere. A few other technical requirements to go over. We want to use proper semantic markup for accessibility and SEO. We want to use SVG icons, not graphics or large fonts. And again, we want to use first-party tools as much as possible without relying on third-party frameworks, tools, plugins, or add-ons. Pinegrow is the tool we use in our agency, and it's actually less of a page builder than it is an entire website builder. It has a module to create themes and plugins for WordPress, but it can also do a whole lot more. One of the reasons I like it is that we have full control over the code of the site, both the HTML and the CSS, and it has visual controls for just about every CSS property we could ask for. On top of that, the tool is incredibly flexible and lets us do just about anything we want to do with it, all the while staying out of the way and not inserting itself in unexpected ways. Pinegrow comes with built-in support for popular frameworks like Tailwind, Bootstrap, Foundation, and others, as well as built-in compilers for Sass and less. Pinegrow even has its own static HTML CMS, which comes in surprisingly handy when developing reusable components. The downside is that it's not built directly into WordPress, so everything we do has to get transferred over using an export process. The good news is Pinegrow is developing an online version that does work as a WordPress plugin. And as a matter of fact, I've created the same project in both the full client and the online version, and everything works just as well in both places. Here we have a simple card grid that could be used on any website. In this example, I'm using it as a bio section for the fictitious law firm Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Let's first take a quick look at the layout. You'll notice in each one, the bio length is a little bit different, but the cards are all the same height. You'll also notice that the social icons on each one of these cards is at the bottom, regardless of the height of the content. You'll notice that each of these headshots are square, even though the photos aren't all 1:1 aspect ratio. The grid is automatically responsive, so it adjusts from 3 columns to 2 columns to 1 column automatically. When I hover over any of these cards, regardless of where I put the mouse, you'll see that the entire card hovers, and that everything except the bio text and the social icons link to the biography page. The biography text is selectable, and each of these social icons, when I hover over them, change their appearance, have tooltip text, and are linked to the appropriate social media site. I can navigate the components by keyboard. By pressing the tab key, it selects the whole component and lets me click on the link. If I hit the tab key again, it'll go to each of the social media icons. The next time I hit tab, it'll go to the second card. And lastly, we can use voice narration on this page.
Heading Level 1 Leadership by Caricature. Enter list. 1 of 3 Level 1. Link. Heading Level 3 Jane Dewey. Senior Partner. Jane is the senior partner in the firm. Jane Dewey headshot. Link. Follow Jane Dewey on Facebook. Link. Follow Jane Dewey on Twitter. Link. Follow Jane Dewey on LinkedIn. 2 of 3. Link. Heading Level 3 Jimmy Cheatham.
A few different things that I want to point out about that voice narration, that it saw each of these as a list item and said list item 1 of 3, 2 of 3, and 3 of 3. You'll also notice that it read the headshot after it read the bio section, and that it read detailed descriptions for each of the social media icons. So now that we know what it looks like and how it's supposed to work, let's jump into building it. We'll start by creating the general structure of the card, then we'll add the links and the hover styles, and lastly we'll work on the social icons. Once all that's built out, we'll make sure it all works properly with keyboard navigation and voice narration and navigation. Looking at what we're going to build, we've got a section that's going to hold this whole thing. Inside of that section, we have our heading, and then we have a container that's going to be a grid container for each one of these grid items. Inside of each of one of these grid items, we have a headshot image, a content section, and a footer section. So that's what we're going to build today. As you see here, we have a relatively blank setup of Pinegrow. We have our PG card demo page with a header, main section, and footer. This is set up to export as a theme inside of WordPress. We have a background color defined, and we have our fonts defined. Aside from that, nothing's been done. The first thing we're going to do is to define all the HTML structure. So we'll take our reference, and I'm just going to move this to the side so we can see what we're doing. I'll make this window a little bit smaller, and we can start building out the HTML. The easiest way to do it is to come over here to the list elements, and we can just drag and drop them either onto the tree view or onto the page. So again, we have a big section that's going to hold everything. Then we have an H1 for this heading. We've got a div that's going to hold the grid. And under that, we're going to have divs for 3 cards. Inside each card, we're going to have a div for the headshot, a div for the content, and a div for the footer. Now let's build that out inside Pinegrow. We'll start off just by grabbing a section element and dropping it onto the page. And you'll notice when you drop a layout element onto the page, it creates a little bit of vertical space. That's a special helper class that they put on here called PG empty placeholder, and it just gives us something so that we can see the space visually. We're going to give this section a name, and that name shows up here in the tree view just for reference. So I'm going to call this card section, and we'll also give it a class. I'll give it a class by clicking on the add class button, typing in card demo for the class, and saying add class. Now what this does, if you look at the code, it adds the class to the HTML, but it doesn't actually do anything to the style sheet just yet, not until we add rules for that class. The next thing we'll add is an H1 for the headline. We'll give it a class of card demo _ headline, and I'll call it headline. We'll also put the text in here while we're at it. Right below our headline, we'll create a div, and this is going to hold the grid. So I'm going to call this card grid, and I'll give it a class of card demo _ grid. Inside the grid is another div for the grid item. And inside of that grid item, we'll have our 3 divs, one for the headshot, one for the contents, and one for the footer. So I'll start by just dragging a div inside of there. And then I can duplicate it 3 ways. I can grab 2 more divs if I want to. I can click on the duplicate button twice, or I can hit the number 2 and duplicate, and that makes my 3 divs. So now let's name and add classes to each of these. With those in place, let's start adding some content. So we'll start with the content section. We'll put our H3 in here for Jane Dewey. Under that, we'll add her title. But I forgot that we don't want to make this a span. We want it to be a regular div. So all I have to do to change it is to right click, say transform to div, and it's now changed it. And then we'll create a paragraph under there. Inside of our headshot wrapper, we'll grab an image, pop it in. By default, it's going to use a placeholder. And I'm going to replace that placeholder. We'll give it an alt text of Jane Dewey headshot. We want the width to be 100%. And that'll span the whole width of the div. And then we'll also enable lazy loading. And you can see as we change each one of these, the attributes up here reflect what we did. And before we leave, we'll give this a name and a class. Lastly, we'll come down to our footer, And inside the footer, we're going to have a div to hold the icon. And then we need to put the icon itself. And to add the icon, I'll just come over to Remix Icons, find the one that I want, copy the SVG code. I can come over here to our Insert Code box, paste it in there, and just drag this right in. Now let's give these two names and classes before we leave. Now that we have all the pieces in place for the card grid, we can take that grid item, duplicate it 2 times, and we're ready to start styling. The first pieces that we're going to style are the card grid and the grid item. So let's start off with the card grid. The first thing you'll notice right now is it's just a plain list, and we want this to be a grid 3 across. So to start styling it, we'll right-click on this, and we'll say Create CSS Rule. We're going to tell it to put it in the style sheet of style.css, and that brings us over to our style editor. In here, we make sure that we have the class selected, and we can start adding properties. I'll come to Position and Display, and under Display, I could do Flex if I wanted to use Flexbox, or I could do Grid. In this case, I want to use CSS Grid, and I'm going to use an interesting feature inside of Pinegrow that's going to let us build this visually. So I'll right-click on the grid, CSS Grid, Edit Grid. I want that rule to be inside of my card demo grid class, and say Create CSS Grid. You'll see this brings up a visual editor. First thing I'm going to do is give this a gap of 2 rems. And as I did that, you should see we now have a gap between all these items. By default, our height is 100 pixels, and you can see that it's overflowing what we have. So I'm going to just change this to auto by double-clicking and selecting auto. Now the grids are 100% height. And instead of using 1 full row for each one of these, I actually want to double-click in here and use this repeat auto fit min max. And what this is going to do is it's going to try to automatically fit the items in there using a minimum of 100 pixels per item and a maximum of 1 full row. So I'll click on that. I'll delete these other 2. And I'm going to change this from 100 pixels to 15 rems. And when I close out of here, you can see that it's created all the rules for me. This works fine in our large view, and I can also pop up a mobile view. And you can see that it automatically made the responsive sizes. While we're at it, I want this div to be 100% width. So I'll put that rule in. And I want to make sure that all of our items stretch from top to bottom. So for example, if I change the text in here, you'll see that it doesn't quite stretch. So to do that, I can say align items, stretch. And if you notice, I wasn't very careful about how I did this, and it made them inline styles instead of part of my class. So let's delete these. Make sure our class is selected and redo it. And now you can see that all my grid items stretch all the way. Now we'll tackle the grid item. The first thing I want to do is make sure our background color is set to white. So we'll come over to our card demo grid item, right click and say Create CSS Rule in my style.css file. I come to my background color section. I could use the color picker if I wanted to, but if you remember, we're trying to use variables for most of these things. So instead of doing this, we'll edit our style sheet. So we'll look at our style sheet code, and we'll create our root section for some variables. Once I've created this variable for pure white, I can now come back into here, click inside of my color, and if I right click, I've got access to all my CSS variables, and I can choose pure white. We also want to put some padding around the inside of this. So let's create a variable for our padding. We'll come over to our style sheet, and we'll add our padding in by right-clicking. We'll use our card padding. And if I click these equal signs, it puts it all the way around. I want to make sure that we're using a display of flex, and that we're using a flex direction of column. We also want to give this a border radius. So again, we'll put that variable in for our card radius. And we'll come back to our visual editor, and we'll select our new variable for card radius, and we'll say use it around all sides. We want to make sure that the grid item is 100% width. I also want to make sure that we're adding the gap between each of our sections inside the grid item. And for that, we use the gap property. But inside the visual editor, we don't actually have a gap property. We do have a grid gap. If we put that in, You can see that it works, but it's not really what we're looking for. So instead, let's delete this. And once again, we're going to add this as a variable, just like we did the last time. We'll come back up here and we can manually create our property. We can click on the little plus button there, say gap, colon, and that created it for us. We want to add a border around this, and we'll create our variable for the border color. We'll come over to our border settings. We'll make this 1.5 pixels, solid. And now we don't have access to right click on this. Maybe we do. Nope, when we right click on it, it wants to change that to the variable. That's not really what I want. So instead we'll leave this as black and we'll just manually set the variable up here. The last thing we'll do is we'll add our box shadow. We'll add that shadow. 2 pixels. 2 pixels. Blur of 40 pixels. Size of -1. All right, now let's save this and do a preview and see what we're looking. And it looks like we have our border just on the top because I forgot to make it all the way around. So we'll come back to our border styles and say use that same border all the way around. That took care of that. Let's tackle the headshot section now. So we'll start with our headshot wrapper. And we'll create some rules for this class. And all I want to do with this right now is just make the width 100%. Most of our work is going to be done on the headshot image. So let's give this that same border radius that we used on the card. We'll right click on here, CSS variables, card radius, make that go all the way around. We'll give this a width of 100%. Aspect ratio is another property that's not inside Pinegrow because it's a relatively new CSS property. So we'll create that manually. But then we will say object fit cover and object position 50%, 20%. Let's save and preview this. There we have it. Now we're going to change the markup of a few things. So if you remember, we want to make the card grid an unordered list and each grid item a list item. So to change this card grid, we just right click on it, transform, and we don't have unordered list in here, so we can just click on the dots and say UL, and that changes that for us. We'll click on the grid item. As a matter of fact, we'll click on all 3 grid items, transform to list items. Now you'll notice we have that padding we want to get rid of, and also because it's a list item, we want to make sure that we're setting a list style type of none. Let's modify our rule over here. We'll look at our margins and paddings. We'll do this for the card grid. Say padding of none. That takes care of that. And for the grid item, we'll say list type style of none. Now we'll look at the style of the card contents. We're going to give this a display of flex. We want our flex direction to be column. We want to make sure that we're aligning our items to the center. We want to set our gap property. We'll make our width 100%. And we'll set that little bit of padding on the left and right. We have our name here. And we're going to give this a font size of 1.5 rems. We want to text align center it. We want to make sure that there's no margins anywhere. And we want to create a variable for the color. So we'll create that variable for text dark. And we'll set the color to text dark. We also want to make sure that we're wrapping this H3 in a wrapper with an anchor. Say insert, content, anchor. And we're going to insert the anchor just before it. And now I can drag this inside there. We'll take my anchor and we'll give it a class and a label. And we want to get rid of this text in here that says link so that the only link is our Jane Dewey. Let's make this a little bigger so we can see what we're looking at. You'll notice that we have an underline that we want to get rid of. And we want to make sure that it's showing the right color. So let's create a rule for this. We're going to say text decoration, none, and color is going to be our text dark. For our job title, we want to create the variable for that text color. So we're going to create that as text medium. We'll come over here, we'll create our rules, set our color to text medium. We'll also set the size to 1 rem, and we'll text align center. And looking at that, it looks like I used the wrong variable. So let's put the right one in of text light. And we'll come back here. We'll select this. We can right click on that and say text light. There, that's much better because this, our body text, is the one that we want to be text medium. Right click on here, create our CSS rule. Body color, text medium. Center align that. Font size is 1 rem. Line height is 1.4. And that takes care of our content section. Now, of course, we want to swap the headshot photo and the content section so that semantically the content comes before the headshot. Let's take care of that right now. We'll just grab this and drag it above. And then we need to make our headshot wrapper in order of -1. So to do that, we just come over to our Flex container properties, say order -1. Now to tackle the footer section, we'll select it. Create our CSS rules. We want a display of flex. Flex direction of row this time. We're going to align item center. We're going to justify content center. We're going to do our gap. We'll give it a width of 100%. We'll give it a tiny bit of padding at the bottom. And again, we want to set that margin auto at the top to bring these all the way down. Inside of the footer, we'll tackle the icon wrapper. And I'm going to just change this from a div over to an anchor. We have our icon already in place. And I'm just going to create some rules for that. First thing I want to do is set the background to our medium white. We want to put some border radius around this and some padding. So let's give this a border radius of 50% all the way around. That makes it a circle. We'll give it a padding of 8 pixels all the way around. And you'll notice that got really tiny because we actually need to change the size of the font from 24 to 32. That looks a lot more reasonable. And now we want to give our icon a fill color. So let's come into our variables. We'll create the fill color as primary color. We'll create a manual rule of fill. There, now it did it. Now we can take this icon wrapper and duplicate it twice. And we've got a nice rough outline for our footer. So let's just come back and replace these SVGs with the Twitter and LinkedIn, and we'll be good to go. Now that we have the card looking the way that we want, all the elements are in place. We'll delete these other 2 placeholder items, and we'll duplicate this one again. The last piece we have to do is just update the content on all these cards, and then we'll be finished with the basic styling. Looks good. Now the last 2 things that we're going to do are create a link wrapper for this whole card and create some accessible icons for the footer. We'll start by grabbing the name wrapper here. This already has a text decoration of none, so that's okay. But we want to take this and we want to make a after style for it. We'll create that in style.css. We need to get this a blank content. Display of flex. We're going to position this absolute. We also have to take a grid item and make this relative. now that makes it clickable. Let's give this a little bit of motion so that we can see what's going on with it. So we'll take this whole grid item, create a hover style for it. Also give it a box shadow. And the last thing we want to do, come down to our grid item, transitions, add transition, property of all, duration, 0.3 seconds, timing function, ease in and out, delay of 0 seconds. And we still need to take care of our footer, so we'll make this footer relative. Let's view this. Now we need to make these accessible. So to do that, we actually need to add some text under this Facebook icon. So we'll put a span under there. We'll change this icon wrapper. We'll make that display a flex column. And we want to hide this from everything except the screen readers. So let's add a class to it called SR only. Writing border of 0, clipping rectangle, path, height with some overflow, margin. Net result is you can no longer see that. But now we have all of that. The last thing we need to do is we need to give an ARIA label to each of these icons. And we still need to add a keyboard style when this is active. We'll come back, create a class. We don't have focus within inside of here, so we'll do this. And instead of using a border, we'll use the box shadow. And there we have it. Now we're going to do some screen reader testing to hear what it sounds like for visually impaired people. First thing we'll do is we'll let this read the whole page.
PG card demo PG card test site document. Visited link skip to main content. Main landmark heading level 1 leadership by caricature list link heading level 3 Jane Dewey senior partner. Jane is the senior partner in the firm, and has long been the face of our personal injury practice. She trained as an associate under Dickie Dewey Jr. Son of the firm's founder. Jane provides decades of wisdom to our staff. While she still assists in marketing and client retention, she spends most of her time treating young male associates and paralegals to vacations in exotic locations as well as in local hourly motels. She's earned it. Graphic Jane Dewey headshot link follow Jane Dewey on Facebook link follow Jane Dewey on Twitter link follow Jane Dewey on LinkedIn link heading level 3 Jimmy Cheatham partner Jimmy heads the firm's criminal defense unit.
Now I'll show some keyboard navigation.
Skip to main content visited link. Main landmark list with 3 items Jane Dewey heading level 3 link. Follow Jane Dewey on Facebook link. Follow Jane Dewey on Twitter link. Follow Jane Dewey on LinkedIn link. Jimmy Cheatham heading level 3 link. Follow Jimmy Cheatham on Facebook link.
And there we have it. The biography card has everything we need to effectively navigate with sight, sound, and keyboard. I'm sure your particular style will look different from this, so feel free to use it as a starting point to build your own card. Everything we've done up until now is 100% platform agnostic and can be done using nothing more than a text editor. In the next set of videos, I'm going to show how we can use the Pinegrow web editor to take this card and turn it into a WordPress block. So we can either add the information directly into the block, or we can use it to dynamically show information from custom post types and custom fields. If you have any questions, or if you found this helpful, I'd love for you to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. To learn more about what we do, you can visit us online at peakperformancedigital.com.